Welcome wherever you are, whatever time zone you're in. Welcome, folks. We're absolutely delighted to have Serge, Andrew, and Michael with us this morning. And I am talking from my little farm in the middle of Northern Ireland, so not quite as glamorous as Kabul or Germany, right? I'm going to talk for about 5 minutes just to ground us here in the local, and we're going to open that up to the international. So Serge will then talk for about 20 minutes, Andrew for roughly 10, and Michael for 10 as well. And folks, we're going to leave time at the end for your Q&A. So if questions come up as we talk, feel free to use them. We can't promise we're going to get through them all, but we'll try and get through as many as we can, all inside the hour. We're going to try and, we have to finish by 12. Serge has a TV appointment, so we will be finishing by then, folks. And this is the start of a conversation, as all of these things are. So myself, I'm one of the program directors within the Windsor Clinton Leadership Institute. We're part of the School of Management within Queen's. I've been involved in conflict resolution, mediation, negotiation for the guts of about 20 years now. And I think it's brilliant that we're actually working with the Institute of Economics and Peace again, and we'll continue this conversation. So what's the aim of this, folks? So firstly, we really want to build upon that existing relationship between the Leadership Institute, the Mitchell Institute, the wider University of Queen's, and the Institute for Economics and Peace. So far, what we've done over the past few years is we've actually launched the Peace Index in previous years, 2 years ago, in Riddle Hall, and we had the founder and chairperson of the IEP, Steve Killay, over with us, thankfully supported by Belfast City Council. And last year, Serge was over, and we actually then co-facilitated a leadership and positive peace index training with support of the British Council for representatives of 2 Colombian cities, again in Riddle Hall. So this is an ongoing process for us, and it's just brilliant to be able to do this in the digital world. And I guess the other aim for us is we want this to be a bit of a taster for an online symposium, an online conference we're planning later on this year, again with that collaborative partnership work, looking specifically at the connection between business and a positive peace. We actually would have done this already if the world hadn't changed around us, right? And we had support by the Community Relations Council. So if you want to know more, folks, use this as a taster for where we're going to go with the conversation. And in the long run, what we'd love to have is we would love to have a peace index for Northern Ireland, the UK and Ireland. And we want to bring that into the local level to help people make decisions and to have a clear look at where we are and where we're going. My personal thought is I think every country should have a peace index, just like the one, for example, Germany just launched, or IEP just launched for Germany in May. Again, if you want to know more about any of these resources, folks, I'm sure Serge will say this will be up on the Institute of Economics and Peace's website as well. So where are we at the minute? So other than working from home, right, in our spare rooms, you know, I guess in the last few weeks, for many of us, the world has changed, right? Global travel and trade systems have collapsed. Social norms have really changed. Those rights and liberties, which we've been so used to, have been revoked and changed, and those social values, at some level, reorientated. Here, in this part of the world, sadly, 551 people have lost their lives in Northern Ireland to COVID-19, according to Department of Health's latest figures. And there have been 1,738 deaths in the Republic of Ireland, and nearly, at the minute, 44,000 deaths in the UK and as a whole. So I think it's just important just to keep that in our minds, folks, in terms of actually really where we're at and the real cost of how things have been recently. And we know it could have been much worse, right? And let's take just a quick look just here for a couple of minutes at this part of the world. In one sense, we're at risk of actually losing a generation here. And what I mean by that is unemployment in Northern Ireland, according to NISRA, has more than doubled in the last couple of months. It's around 5.5% at the minute, and particularly bad for young people. How do people get back into work? And let's be honest, we have little sense of actually how many jobs will, once people have been furloughed, how many of those will permanently be lost, and what is the impact of that from an economic sense? I mean, some headlines this morning, in terms of the UK in general this week, they're talking around 10,000 jobs being lost this week, and it's only Thursday, right? Looking at some of the latest statuses, even this morning from Danske Bank, in terms of economically wise, we're talking potentially a shrinkage of 11% in the Northern Irish economy this year. Now, there is one view that may then grow again next year. By some people are predicting Danske are predicting around 7% next year growth. But then what happens if, for example, in the autumn, there's a localized lockdown in Belfast, right? What does that do to the economy here? And what does that do to how people deal with that? And we can't underestimate the issues arising from childcare or lack of it and associated challenges that this has brought for working families, right? I have a wee 1-year-old and a 4-year-old running around at the minute. So if anything does come flying sideways at me, apologies in advance, right? We are all at the BBC guy now. And let's not underestimate the mental health issues, because a lot of those are only just beginning. Again, some people are now talking about COVID-19 survivors having to be treated for PTSD, for example. And let's be honest, the autumn financial figures are going to be pretty grim reading. We're almost certainly going to show some type of a recession here. When the UK and Ireland, much like the rest of the world, the US is already in recession due to COVID. The only real question left is, what kind of recession is it going to be? Is it going to be, what shape is it going to be? It's going to be a V, a U, a W, an L, in the worst case. Really, what are we asking? We're asking how bad is it going to be? And ultimately then, what will the government reaction to this be? How will that play out in our communities? How will that play out in our businesses? And this here is all in the context of a power sharing government, which is only really back up and running, 6 months now? And we did manage over 1,000 days here without a government. And one for you, Serge, we actually beat the Belgian government's previous record of 589 days. So a good bit of a pop quiz nugget for you there. And guess what? I haven't even mentioned the good old Brexit word yet. And lest we forget that we are 6 months from ending the transition period. And the deadline to ask for an extension was Tuesday last. And we didn't ask for one, right? So what's the autumn going to play out like that? And if there is a harder Brexit, what does that do for here? What does that do for the UK, Ireland, but particularly our region of the world? What does that do for intercommunal relations? We're going to need support, financial support in many sectors, everything from community and voluntary sector, the hospitality in particular, the arts and tourism, and what do we do with those stimulus packages? Because it's not just an amount of how much we stimulate those parts of the economy, for example, but where. Because one of the many things I've taken over the years about particularly the work of the IEP and their positive peace index, and that systems perspective, that interconnection between, as they call it, the pillars of positive peace, and two particularly, for example, this idea of a sound business environment and how that connects to an equitable distribution of resources. But we know what happens if money flows unequitably into that system. And we know that those things can actually exacerbate pre-existing tensions. What will that look like, 24 months from now, 3 years from now, what we do now, and how will that impact it? Thinking about the impact on our societies from the last financial crash, for example. And ultimately, COVID-19 may exacerbate those old societal cleavages and potentially create new ones both here and abroad. I mean, just look at the headlines this morning, So how do we lead through this crisis in the years and the months ahead? Where do we fit in this larger picture? That's the context for where we're at and where we're living it. But what does the world look like today? And where does this idea of a global peace index and a peace framework actually fit into that? Where do we fit in? And where are we going? So folks, over to Serge to give us a real deep dive into that. And then we'll be over to Andrew and Michael, and let's open that up for a conversation. Welcome this morning, folks. And if you want to know more about us, give us a shout. Serge.
Thank you very much, Enda, and thank you very much, Sue, for such a nice introduction. And I really listened to you with a lot of passion, Enda. And as you said, this is a standing cooperation, and the Institute for Economics and Peace is really pleased to be partnering with you guys in Belfast and Northern Ireland. Thank you also to the other panelists who joined today, and thank you also to many people in the audience that will share this all with us. What I will do is share my screen and use my PowerPoint now. So yeah, let's talk about the Global Peace Index 2020 and what the Institute for Economics and Peace is doing is researching on peace and the link with economics, and we measure and quantify peace. We do this for general audience, but also for specific organizations, international organizations, governments, international NGOs, and we do that also to be included in a lot of university courses and to influence the maximum of persons. So next to the research that we do, we also promote a lot the research and the results that we do, because we think that if they would get applied into policy and decision making, we might create a better world. Actually, just for this Global Peace Index that has been released on the 10th of June, we have already registered a media reach for more than 6 billion, close to 3,000 articles and press releases have been published worldwide. So I'm going to talk about the Global Peace Index 2020, but also about a research paper called COVID-19 and Peace that is looking on the impact of COVID-19, I would say, related to the preparedness of different nations and different countries, and also the impact that the aftermath will have on our societies and our economy. Both reports and all our research is available open source, free online, on our website visionofhumanity.org, and of course click on reports. We are headquartered in Sydney, Australia, and we have regional offices in Brussels, really connecting to the institutions here in Europe, supported by an office in The Hague. We have an office in New York, of course, close to the UN headquarters. This is connected to an office in Mexico City, as we have been producing a national peace index over there for Mexico, ranking the 32 states of Mexico according to the levels of peacefulness. And about 18 months ago, we opened an office in Southern Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Harare. So this is the 14th edition of the Global Peace Index. We rank 163 countries and territories. That's about 99.7% of the world's population. So I think we might call it a global index. We use 23 indicators, receiving a weight from 1 to 5 on a scale. We developed this index of self, and it's guided and overseen by a panel of international experts. 23 indicators distributed over 3 domains. So we have 6 measures of ongoing domestic and international conflict. We have 10 measures of societal safety and security, basically looking at internal security, and 7 measures of militarization. One of those measures of militarization is a rather positive measure, and this is looking at funding for UN peacekeeping operations. So let's discuss the key findings now. For each of the indexes we produce, you will also always find an interactive map like this one on the screen on our website. So this is already giving you a first approach of the most peaceful regions of the world, or countries in the world, so in dark green and green, and the least peaceful countries and regions of the world in, I would say, orange and dark red. This also gives you a first impression of the concentration of peace, but also, unfortunately, concentration of violence. It's an interactive map, so you can click on each of the countries and access all the data per indicator, per family of indicator on the global ranking. So really useful tool. We experienced a decrease of peacefulness last year by 0.34%. So this is just a figure, but what you need to know also is that over the past 12 years, this is the 9th deterioration over the last 12 years. We saw that about the same amount of countries improved and deteriorated, and the changes came from those different indicators. So the positive change, so the improvements came from less exchange of weapons, so less import and export of weapons. We saw a continued trend of dropping homicide rates globally, so that's fine. And we also saw the terrorism impact dropping dramatically last year, -75%, so that's very good. And also continuing a trend that we have seen since 2014-15 and the peak of the Islamic State. In those days, 33,500 people were killed in a year. Last year, only 8,000. Of course, 8,000 too much or too many. But yeah, I mean, a steep decrease there also since 2014-15. Deteriorations came from the intensity of internal conflicts that were fought. We also saw that the number of refugees and IDPs really rocketed again last year. In 1 year, plus 10 million, going from 70 million last year to 80 million today. Over a period of a decade, this number has doubled, going from 40 to 80 million. And we also saw that the political terror scale had a negative impact on the peace index. Political terror scale, this is extrajudicial killing, imprisonment without trial, the use of torture, state terror, these kind of things. So when you look at the highlights for this year, Iceland, #1, New Zealand, #2, followed by European countries, rather smaller countries, liberal democracies. If you look at the top 30, 40 of the Global Peace Index, you will find a lot of those small countries, liberal democracies, of course, with some exceptions confirming the rule. The largest improvement, so national improvements, came from Azerbaijan and Armenia that settled their border dispute on Nagorno-Karabakh last year. So, of course, this has a very important influence on your ranking on the index, but still, Armenia, 99th on the index, Azerbaijan, 120. So it's just an improvement. I mean, they did not become super peaceful overnight. This has, of course, an impact on the region Russia-Eurasia, the largest regional improvement. And Europe remains the most peaceful region of the world, although we have seen a rise in political instability and therefore a small decrease in the levels of peacefulness. So the other end of the index, the bottom of the index, Afghanistan remains, and that's for at least the second year in a row, the least peaceful nation in the world, and we have seen a deterioration of their levels of peacefulness over the last decade. Benin and Nicaragua are the largest deteriorations. Benin, induced by elections that were linked with a lot of violent use of violence and the violent protests, and also, I would say, the influence, jihadist influence from the north. Nicaragua has been there for a couple of years now, clearly impacted by the intensity of the internal conflict, crime rate, also homicide rate, and yeah, that's basically destabilizing this country and the entire region and sub-region. South America and Central America, largest regional deteriorations. This is also a trend that is being established, and really with staggering figures. So we need to keep a close eye on those two regions in the coming years. The MENA region, so Middle East, North Africa, still the least peaceful region of the world, although we did see improvements on the death caused both from terrorism and the internal conflict. And we also saw that civil unrest that has been on the rise everywhere else did not really have an impact on the levels of peacefulness there in the MENA region. So those are the most 10 peaceful regions of the world. So Iceland, New Zealand, those European liberal democracies, Canada and Japan are also there. And of course, one non-liberal actor, but at least, as I said, the exception confirming the rule. This is the bottom of the index. Of course, those countries that are in the violence trap, in conflict, just emerging, and that might be challenged again by the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic aftermath. So really almost no surprises there. So the trends in peace, let's open the time window to a decade for about 12 years. So I said 9 deteriorations year on year over the past 12 years and only 3 improvements, of which 2 very small improvements. So clearly this is leading to a decrease in peacefulness over the last 12 years by 2.5%. We saw that the same amount of country has improved and deteriorated, but the speed at which this change occurred is completely different. So countries are getting average more peaceful by 2%, while those countries deteriorating will do that by average 13%. And this is, of course, leading to this type of slides showing a growing gap, a growing inequality between the most and the least peaceful regions of the world. We have done research about this happening, and we clearly see also that the type of political regime that is used in a country will have a different impact on the levels of peacefulness, or at least a deterioration in peacefulness. And of course, authoritarian regimes will see the levels of peacefulness decreased faster than other types of regimes. Civil unrest, so we did a special special study this year on civil unrest worldwide. We have seen that in general, or average, there was an increase by 244% of the level of the number of civil unrests. In the details, if you would go to riots, which would be the violent civil unrest, 282% increase, general strikes even more than 800%. Last year, 96 countries recorded a violent demonstration, and the reasons why people are taking the grievances and frustrations to the streets are really diverse, ranging from economic hardship, what we have seen in the past weeks, racism, police brutality, corruption, and many, many more, of course, climate change, and many more issues that will take people to the streets. Europe registered the largest number of protests, but only 35% were violent. So the largest number of protests for Europe, so we clearly see that in all the liberal democracies in Europe, people are really using this fundamental freedom of speech, fundamental freedom of protest and demonstration, but most of the time it's not violent, 35% only. Those figures are, of course, completely different in other parts of the world. Example of Sub-Saharan Africa, an increase by 6 to another %, and almost all of those protests turned out to be violent at some point. What we also expect is that the economic recession that already started and definitely also still lies ahead of us will have an impact on the likelihood of demonstration and riots, and that the level of violence that will be used in those demonstrations is, of course, directly connected to the preparedness and the answers that countries have given to the COVID-19 crisis and the economic crisis that followed the pandemic. With every index produced, we also produced an evaluation of the economic impact of violence or the economic cost of peace, or the economic value of peace. So this year, the estimation, and it's a very conservative estimation, is 14.5 trillion invested in violence in 2019, and that's about 10.6% of the world GDP, or about $1,900 per person participating in this webinar. So just imagine what we can do. And I said, very conservative, times 2.5 would be much closer to reality. You can only count what you can measure, I would say. So just imagine what you could do if you would decrease this economic impact of violence by 1 or 10%. 1% would equal the global annual budget for overseas aid development. 10% equals the global annual budget for foreign direct investment. So just imagine what you could do. This is the distribution of this budget. So you see that about 75 to 80% of the budget is spent on taking care of the threat of violence, or the fear of violence. So we are going to invest in the military, going to invest in internal security, and this is topped off also by private and military security companies who also receive part of this investment. So that's about 40, 35, and 5.6%, so about 75 to 80%. The direct use of violence, so homicide, suicide, conflict, and violent crime, is there, but in a smaller proportion. There is also a special focus this year, one chapter on COVID-19 and peace, and I said this special research paper, COVID-19 and peace. The first correlation that we established is a correlation between the level of air travel and the take-up of COVID-19. So we have identified that these larger international airport hubs really were entry points for COVID-19 and also start of the spread of the virus in other parts of the world. Therefore, Europe and the United States, but Europe first, United States after that, and on both sides of the United States, really from Asia on the west coast and from Europe on the east coast, the contamination came in the more developed world. And we saw a very high take-up of COVID-19 in the developed world because of those airport hubs like Brussels, for example, where I come from, really a central point within Europe and a strong connection to Africa also, and to the other parts of the world, of course, Heathrow in the UK, New York with 3 international airports, Milan, a lot of tourism transiting through Spain also, so clearly a connection there. And unfortunately, in this part of the world, we also saw very resilient societies and very resilient health systems, so that we're able to also provide an answer to a certain point to this larger intake of COVID-19. What we also see is that COVID-19 had needed more time to reach other parts of the world, Central and Southern America at the moment, Africa in the coming weeks. But therefore, there where the resilience is lower, we will see that the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic, will last for much longer, will also take more time to reach more people, but the solutions there are not going to be presented very soon, not a lot of resilience, so therefore the impact will last for much longer also, and also have a much larger impact on the local economies that are already under pressure. We expect that most of the indicators of both the Global Peace Index, measuring negative peace, which is the absence of violence, the fear of violence, as the positive peace index, and Enda, thank you for mentioning that, those indicators are going to deteriorate in the coming years. There is like a positive note, so large portions of the budget of the financial assets will be redirected to the economies that needs to be propped to really be saved, and therefore there might be less budget that could be directed to military expenditure. So that's a positive note. What we also have seen is that certain type of crimes, so petty and violent crime, like drug dealing, for example, we saw a temporary reduction as a result of the lockdown or of the isolation. But therefore, and you mentioned mental illness, and absolutely correct, level of suicide increased, and also level of domestic violence. And usually, with domestic violence, the aggressor and the victim were still blocked and locked up in the same location. What we also see, what we also expect is a rise, an increase in the political instability, both in US and in Europe. So continue with the key findings of COVID-19 and peace. US and China relations are deteriorating. This is not new. This was already going on. It already started before the pandemic. But the pandemic and the economic crisis might act as an accelerator, kind of a catalyst of this process. And this will definitely have a very strong impact on the multilateral world in which we live. And for example, organizations such as international organizations such as WHO, WTO, and we already witnessed what happened in the UN Security Council in the debates after the call by the UN Secretary General for a global ceasefire mid-March. So the more negative side of economy or money being propped in the economies, we might see that budgets for overseas development aid, but also for UN peacekeeping operations, might decrease. And we really think, especially with this systemic approach to peace, this concept of positive peace, that a reduced investment in developmental aid would be something very, very negative, especially for those fragile countries such as Liberia, Afghanistan, Burundi, and South Sudan, who really rely on this support. We also expect that countries with currently low credit ratings, such as Brazil, Pakistan, Argentina, and Venezuela, will have more difficulties to borrow money, and therefore will not be able to invest enough in the economies. Therefore, longer-term impact of the economic crisis and larger and stronger impact of this crisis also. Basically, what we did in this COVID-19 and peace report, we looked at the levels of positive peace of the countries that were under scrutiny, and we correlated it with the economic preconditions. The economic preconditions were the level of unemployment, the level of structural debt. We also looked at the percentage of taxation within your GDP, and we also looked at the dependence on international trade of your economy. Of course, the favorable preconditions would be low levels on the 4 indicators, and if you connect this with high level of positive peace, that's the blue box. Those countries will have more ease to get out of the effects of the pandemic and the economic crisis. The economic crisis will be not so impactful. On the other side of the spectrum, the other end of the spectrum, the red box, those are clearly countries that are have low levels of positive peace and do not really meet favorable of those preconditions. What is worrying me there is Brazil and South Africa, 2 regional powers that will be strongly affected by COVID-19. I mean, we have the figures of Brazil, but just like mind-blowing, and also the economic crisis that is going to follow. Enda, you also spoke about the global financial crisis of 2007-2008. This was one of the previous recessions in the US and therefore also in the global system. And what we have seen in the previous ones is that there was a system called interest rates, or playing with this variable, the interest rate, that would allow you to mitigate, to contain a little bit the impact of an economic crisis. So usually average of decrease of the interest rate by 5% point would mitigate the effects of the crisis. This is not possible now. We don't have this variable anymore because we started with an interest rate at 1.5% just before the pandemic and the economic crisis. So I guess that the only solution we have at hand is basically propping money, propping financial assets and fiscal assets into our economies. A last chapter of the Global Peace Index this year is the Ecological Threat Register. This is going to evolve to a standalone research paper by the end of August, early September. It's going to be presented at the UN General Assembly in September. There, we really looked at several indicators, so food scarcity, water scarcity, demographic evolution, rising levels of the oceans, other climate hazards, and we compare that to the levels of violence that are used, basically the ranking of the Global Peace Index. I spoke about these 18 million refugees and IDPs before. About 60% of this number is created by natural disaster, 40% is created by conflict. And we have seen that over the past 40 years, we saw that the number of natural disasters, but also the intensity of natural disasters, quadrupled. So we clearly see that this is going to have an impact on future displacement also. This is showing you the water-related risks. So basically, we are talking about water scarcity here. And what we see is that the regions most affected are already today. So this is not projected in the future. It's already today. The MENA region, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central America, and the Caribbean. And let those 4 regions also be the 4 least peaceful regions of the world also. So basically what we are looking at, and there is also a correlation here between food security and positive peace, or a negative correlation between low levels of positive peace and food insecurity. So what we are looking at here at the moment is about 2.4 billion people already living in an area or country that is exposed to high or very high risk of climate hazards. So already feeling the effects of climate change. A little bit more than 50% of this number, about 1.25 billion people, also live in one of the 40 countries at the bottom of the index. So there's a clear correlation there between several factors, several strategic factors influencing peace and security, and the levels of peacefulness or the use of violence. And so basically what we are looking at is kind of small storms. So each indicator or each factor could be one storm, violence could be another one, use of violence could be another one. And we see that all those different issues, actually I'm here in Germany today at the General Staff College of the German Armed Forces. We are discussing about peace and security in Africa. And that's a perfect example where you see all those strategic factors really uniting and creating one superstorm. And that's exactly what we need to avoid in the future. We need to keep those strategic factors really stopping from being interconnected and creating these larger superstorms. So basically, that's the end of my presentation. As said, everything available on visionofhumanity.org. Before I leave you to the two other panelists, one more figure, and this is really, those are the numbers who struck my mind the hardest, the most when I read the Global Peace Index. By 2050, so this is within the next 30 years, so that's tomorrow in international relations, international politics, climate change alone, only climate change, so one strategic security factor, is foreseen to generate about 143 million displaced persons, so refugees and IDPs. Distribution, 86 million sub-Saharan Africa, 40 million South Asia, 17 million Central America and the Caribbean. And I leave you the analysis of the destination of those people once they start to move and the impact it will have on their own society, on their own continent, but also on those continents that are still today the most peaceful regions and continents of the world. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the Q&A, and I leave the floor to the next panelist. Thank you for organizing this. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Serge. Really appreciate that. Some loads of data there to get our heads around, folks, and that interconnection between the environment, the impact of COVID, and peace in general. What does that look like and feel like for us? Folks, do keep posting questions as we go. We'll try and get through as many as we can. And over to Andrew. Thanks, Serge.
Well, thank you, Serge, so much for the really comprehensive overview and data on conflict and peace and human security around the world. I think the IEP is doing truly impressive work in this space. Also, of course, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this webinar, and thank you to everyone for joining us. My name is Andrew Thomson, and I'm a lecturer at Queen's University Belfast and a fellow at the Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice. Following on what from Serge just said, there's almost an infinite amount of things that I can speak to. But I wanted to contribute to this conversation about how COVID-19 impacts conflict, security, and peace by drawing on some of my own research to explore a couple of themes that are not necessarily captured or reflected in some of the data that Serge went through. Instead, hopefully I will contribute to the picture that the data painted by giving us a sense of how COVID-19 has had certain effects on the ground in various conflict situations around the world. Now, I want to do that by exploring two main themes. The first theme is that in ongoing civil conflicts in various countries around the world, COVID-19 and the lockdown measures that were introduced to combat it has shifted the strategies that warring parties have adopted, at least in the immediate short term. So basically, as the virus first spread around the world and the World Health Organization gave it official pandemic status and lockdown measures were introduced, both governments and non-state armed actors in conflict had to readjust their strategies to take COVID-19 into consideration. So one aspect of this, of course, was on the 23rd of March 2020, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for a global ceasefire. Many non-state armed groups have implemented a ceasefire with their enemies, and rather than fighting, have spent time reorganizing, consolidating control in areas that they reign, and attempting to further legitimize their authority. So, for example, in Colombia, where I do a lot of research, the ELN insurgent group declared a unilateral ceasefire over coronavirus in April in response to this global ceasefire call, and stated their willingness to continue peace talks with the government. Meanwhile, the ELN and various other paramilitary and criminal organizations have themselves enforced lockdown in areas of their control. They've also provided public goods such as healthcare, unemployment benefits, and food to help people facing the challenges of COVID-19 in their respective areas of control. So pretty much most of the groups acceded to the need for lockdown measures to prevent spreading the disease, and the strategies focused more internally into the areas of their control. However, having said this, it is worth pointing out that the ELN have now rescinded that ceasefire and continued fighting at the end of April, saying that the government did not take their offer for peace seriously. Yet, on the other hand, many other groups around the world are using COVID-19 and lockdown to their strategic advantage. So some government forces have used security measures during COVID-19 as a guise to advance their control and or as a vehicle for repression. So such measures could include indefinite bans on large public gatherings, which many governments have already instituted to stop COVID-19, in order to prevent public protests. So there are precedents here from West Africa's Ebola crisis. Local civil society groups and opposition parties claim that the authorities in various countries prohibited meetings for longer than necessary as a way of suppressing legitimate protests. A harbinger, perhaps, of what is to come may have appeared already in Hungary, where the Prime Minister Viktor Orbán asked Parliament on the 21st of March to indefinitely extend a state of emergency that prescribes 5-year prison sentences for those disseminating false information and obstructing state's crisis response. In addition, some non-state armed groups have used COVID-19 lockdown as a way to seek out their enemies. So in Colombia, again, for example, clandestine paramilitary forces have used the lockdown sort of as a cover of darkness, so to speak, to more easily locate and attack social leaders and community leaders. The country, Colombia, has seen a spike in the assassinations of social leaders and human rights defenders and so on during this lockdown period. So to tie this first theme up, so COVID-19 and lockdown have had a profound short-term effect on warring groups' strategic outlooks. Some pounced on the opportunity to declare a unilateral ceasefire or even a bilateral one, but for others it presented a moment of opportunity for predation. We have yet to see how COVID-19 will impact armed groups' long-term strategies. Okay, so the second theme that I wanted to explore very briefly, and I think perhaps even a more important theme, is that we have not yet covered, is that the effects of COVID-19 are not experienced equally by everybody, right? And I have two brief points to make here. The first sub-point is, let us not forget that the vulnerability of conflict-affected populations, women, children, disabled, refugees, migrants, the poorest sections of society, so on and so forth. COVID-19 will, and the lockdown measures that accompany it, will compound the effects of violence, existing inequalities, and the disintegration of a positive peace, but particularly for those most vulnerable in society. In many cases, war or prolonged unrest, especially where compounded by mismanagement, corruption, or foreign sanctions, have left national health services profoundly ill-equipped for dealing with COVID-19 and its effects. So, for example, in Gaza, the healthcare system, weakened by years of blockade and conflict, was ill-equipped to serve the high-density population long before COVID-19. And now the health ministry has been scrambling to obtain the supplies necessary for when the disease sweeps in. In cases of active conflict, national and international medics and humanitarian actors may struggle to get relief to those people in most need of it. So, for example, in 2019, the World Health Organization and international NGOs struggled to contain an Ebola outbreak in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, despite support from UN peacekeepers, due to violent local militias that blocked access to some affected areas. The second related point to this is that under this theme is that in many countries around the world, the effects of COVID-19 on violence and positive peace are gendered, right? So, for example, even in Northern Ireland, according to PSNI statistics, since lockdown has been implemented, there's been a decline in violent crimes overall, but a dramatic increase in domestic violence against women. So to bring both of those really important points together in this last final theme that I wanted to explore is that I think it's important to remember that disasters such as COVID-19 tend to exacerbate pre-existing power hierarchies and inequalities. So in thinking about the effects of COVID-19 on conflict, security and peace and responses to it, we should therefore also be sensitive to the intersectional structural inequalities that people experience. And I'm wondering whether or not and how those kind of structural inequalities and between different sets and groups of people might be reflected in this data compiled by the Global Peace Index in the future. Thank you very much. I think that's it from me. Just two very brief points there. One on insurgent strategy or armed group strategies in response to COVID-19, and the other about certain inequalities, structural inequalities, and the ways in which those are exacerbated by COVID-19. So thank you very much. Very brief topic there. Thank you.
Brilliant, Andrew. You crammed a lot in a very brief period of time, so thank you. And I love that going out to the macro and bringing it back to here, to what people are experiencing behind closed doors, literally at the minute, and what everything that has happened in the past few months has done to that. So, folks, we want to bring in Michael now from Kabul. Delighted you can join us, Michael. Coming from, according to the IEP, the world's least peaceful country, right? So I think it would be a nice way to put things into context. Where are we compared to there, for example? And just some thoughts from yourself and some of the things you've heard, Michael. Thank you.
Yes, first, can I check that you've got my audio okay? Do you hear me all right?
We can indeed. Thanks, Michael.
Good. I don't think that anybody in Afghanistan would be surprised by the finding that Afghanistan is now at the bottom of the index as the least peaceful country in the world. It sort of confirms what people here already believed. They also that now we've slipped into the position of the highest number of deaths from internal conflict in the world, and that it's not getting better. I think that it should be an occasion for reflection for all of us involved in international peacekeeping. Of course, Afghanistan has been a priority for the international community for much of the 42 years of the conflict. There's been 20 years of various forms of international and direct intervention. The fact that Afghanistan ends up at the bottom of this index it's an indictment. It's a sense of collective failure. But it also comes at a time when we see a reduction in international will to be involved in peacemaking in Afghanistan, rather than a resolution to deal with the worst problem on the planet. But the other sort of initial reaction would be that such indices, of course, they give a glimpse. Certainly in the fieldwork here, I find a rising popular mood against the war, which doesn't, of course, get captured in such indices. I think we always have to remember that continuation of conflict is far from inevitable. Peacemaking is a struggle. Many variables will determine the outcome of that. To bring together the COVID-19 with the index in Afghanistan, I think the pandemic tips the balance in the war in favor of the non-state armed actors. It tips the balance in favor of the Taliban and away from the state, while simultaneously reducing the effectiveness of the institutions tasked with working for peace. COVID makes peace more difficult in the Afghan context. I just give you a few glimpses of how that looks here before then just summing up the main form of impact that we see. Right at the start of the crisis, when Guterres put out his global appeal for ceasefires, I also engaged with the Taliban leadership to try and explain this thing that's coming is really, really big. That your reputation in history will be sullied if you fail to take moves against COVID and if you insist on sustaining the violence, which will inevitably increase the deaths from COVID. They gave a good hearing, but ultimately they decided to ignore the advice that they were being given. They adopted no lockdown measures, made no concessions to the requirements of COVID control, other than a few publicity stunts. And they certainly did not reduce their violence. Au contraire, they've pushed it up. The interesting thing is that when this is all evaluated, they may conclude they did the right thing. We'll see. Next quick case study. I witnessed the aftermath of a government military operation, sort of halfway through the surge of COVID through Afghanistan. The effects were obvious. This is up in the north of Afghanistan, somewhere called Kaisar. Commando unit was just being flown out as I arrived there. They basically hadn't fought because it all turned in sick. Nobody really believed that they had COVID, but they're able to invoke COVID to stay out of the fight. So the fighting was, even on the government side, was left largely in the hands of the police and local militias. But aerial support in this kind of conflict is really important. The key contract for support flights to the Afghan government have been cancelled because of non-availability of international staff. The balance clearly had been tipped towards the Taliban, whose fighters are basically local men, use light infantry weapons, show up for battle on their motorbikes, and buy their ammunition in the local black market. Essentially, COVID had zero impact on their army in the field. But then, if we turn to what happens to the peacemaking efforts, for the past 2 years, we've had a high-profile diplomatic effort led by U.S. Special Envoy Ambassador Khalilzad. The centerpiece of his peacemaking efforts is the attempt to get intra-Afghan negotiations at an international venue to come up with an internal political settlement. And guess what? He was scheduled to convene them around the 10th of March. We're now into July. They haven't happened. Now, COVID is not the only reason why they haven't happened. With great difficulty, they've patched together a possible arrangement which might allow people to fly into Qatar and do a rapid quarantining. But COVID clearly has complicated the factors. Ambassador Khalilzad was meant to be in Kabul this week. His government wouldn't allow him to fly in because of fear of COVID. Not actually for general fear of COVID in Afghanistan, because of an outbreak inside the US embassy itself. The basic tools of diplomacy which have been used in this peace effort have been taken away from us. The Western presence on the ground in the world's worst conflict has simply disappeared. And I can tell you, during my field work over the past 3 months, I've encountered a Westerner on 3 occasions, again, in the worst conflict area in the world. So anyway, so just to wind up on towards the main effects, understanding the effect of COVID on conflict in Afghanistan, you've got to remember that it's a totally different context in Afghanistan from what you're looking at in Europe. That ineffective quarantine measures only apply to some of the population because Afghanistan is a dualist society with a limited state writ, predominantly young population, lower mortality rates here than if COVID were let rip in somewhere like Europe. And essentially what's happened here is it has been let rip. Although official figures do not keep pace with it, the impression we get on the ground is that Afghanistan is moving rapidly towards herd immunity. Although there are officially measures here, they aren't effective and they cannot stop the spread of COVID. But finally, on the COVID context, because of the protracted conflict, perhaps society has some resilience to conflict, which actually allows people to cope with COVID, even in the absence of state-led measures. Another final bit of context that how COVID affects the conflict also depends upon the vision for peace. Most realistic visions for peace in Afghanistan involve a central role for the state. If COVID is tipping the balance between state and other actors, of course that's of critical importance. So I think four key effects of COVID on conflict here. First is that state formal structures are hit worse by loss of revenue, loss of global linkages, the need to apply corona protocols than the non-state actors who are fighting against them in the conflict. Those informal structures, including Taliban insurgents, they are more resilient because they're less dependent on global linkages. They don't have to apply corona protocols. There's no political pressure on them to be responsible, to contribute to checking the spread of corona. And also, essentially, they are confident that they can sustain limited losses to their fighting age males through corona, and therefore they have not lost a single day's fighting over concern over COVID. But if you're looking at the sort of the broader effect on conflict as captured by the index, of course, livelihoods are key. The biggest effects of COVID so far in the population are, of course, reduced incomes, increased staple prices from the disruption of cross-border trade. I mean, that's the real effect so far. And then a key worrying effect for those of us who want to see an end to the war in Afghanistan: reduced international commitment to Afghanistan. Perhaps the withdrawal of the Western presence so far, or sort of the rendering it invisible because anybody who's still here is just working by video conference. Perhaps it's temporary, but actually it may go permanent. There's a risk of withdrawal of personnel, withdrawal of budgets. Afghanistan, despite being the most least peaceful country, becoming a lower priority at a time when persistence is key in peacemaking. So just, I mean, at the end, I would say that if this kind of thing is happening, if the whole peacemaking effort in Afghanistan has been turned upside down by COVID, I mean, there is perhaps an element of hope in that, because after the 2 years of a peace initiative which hasn't delivered peace, 20 years of intervention which has still left us with the least peaceful country in the world, the last thing we need is a return to business as usual. So I do hope that as we come to grips with the COVID crisis, there is a rethink of the way that peacemaking is supported in Afghanistan.
Brilliant, brilliant, Michael. Thanks very much, Michael. And again, there's an awful lot to take in there in a short period of time, and I think that was a brilliant synopsis of something that is quite different than what we're obviously experiencing here. Folks, I'm also aware of time. We've got 3 brilliant questions, which we're not going to get to, unfortunately, in terms of the time, so apologies. I know Serge has got the media engagement in the next 3 or 4 minutes. So just to bring us in, folks, from our perspective, the other question for us in the background of all is, what about leadership? Where's the leadership in the middle of all of this, right? Where is the macro leadership? And we've already talked and heard Michael talk about the USA in the middle of that. What about home here in terms of Stormont? What about the leadership within our communities and the leadership within our business communities? What and how and where and what will that look like over the months and years ahead? So just before Serge heads off, maybe to connect things in, I want to formally thank Andrew and Michael. But Serge, particularly from yourself, any final comments before you rush off for your media spotlight?
Well, thank you, Enda, and you're right to say that I only have 3-4 minutes left, because in my introduction it has been said that I'm at the General Staff College here in Germany, so they always start 2 minutes early, so I need to rush off. I think I was really impressed by this webinar this morning, and also the quality of the two co-panelists, with Andrew really wrapping it up exactly what is happening. I mean, I did a webinar with PRIO, so the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, really a couple of weeks ago, and they did research on this call for global ceasefire. And what we see throughout the world is that really a positive impact on ceasefire would be the exception, and most of the conflicts remain at the same level of violence, and I would say maybe more. Taking advantage of the opportunity either to reorganize, reinforce before the next push, or really taking, as Michael has explained, also a gap in leadership or a gap in diplomacy, or maybe another window of opportunity that arose with the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's clearly something we need to be aware of, and we need to look out for. As said, less funds going towards development aid or peace building. That's super negative. And I guess there the point that I would like to make representing the Institute for Economics and Peace, is the need to invest in positive peace and keep those levels high. I think one of the very positive signs of positive peace is the fact that you can invest in the 8 pillars you spoke about, and especially when they interconnect the transformation that is produced by these 8 pillars. What I'm trying to do now with a lot of governments and a lot of international organizations is telling them you need to continue to invest in peace, and you will create an economic benefit that comes from this situation. One of the points I'm going to discuss in a minute about Africa, I mean, when you look at the impact, the cost of violence in Africa, you see that countries affected see 30 to 40%, same thing for Afghanistan, it's even higher. You see 30 to 40% of the GDP getting invested in the violence and also the fear of violence. So all the assets that you need to develop to take care of violence. This is money, this is part of the GDP, and you know, the violence is also having a lot of impact on other parts of the GDP, like agriculture, like tourism, things like this. So this economic impact does not allow to redistribute assets to really the real issues, the core, the root issues that are creating violence, and you get into this vicious circle. And this is a circle we need to break, and unfortunately the situation in which we live at the moment, neither this nor the expectations that we have for the future give us a really positive picture of the levels of peacefulness this year. So again, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's a great webinar, it's a great collaboration with Queen's University, and I'm looking forward to our next visit to Belfast to continue this very, very interesting collaboration. I need to leave now, it's 19:59, I will be just on time for my next meeting. Thank you very much again, and have a nice rest of the day, and for Michael in Kabul, stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you very much for your work. I think it's super necessary, and seeing you calling in from Kabul is showing that at least some of the Westerners are still active in the country. So good luck for you, and please stay safe. So bye for now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Serge. Thank you, and good luck with your presentation.
Thank you.
And folks, just to wrap everything up from us, folks, I mean, the intention of this was to continue the relationship between Leadership Institute, the Mitchell Institute, and the wider Queen's University with the Institute for Economics and Peace, and to serve for all of you as a bit of a taster for a wider event with which we'll hope to have Michael and Andrew involved towards the end of the year, and that will be a virtual event as well, folks. Serge has shared his email address with you, so for the people who've asked the really, really great questions, folks, in terms of the time, feel free to direct those directly at Serge, or you can get Michael, Andrew, or myself through Queen's, through the website and stuff as well, folks. Feel free to give us a direct connection. And if you're interested in the training between Queen's and the Institute for Economics and Peace, give us a shout. Thank you to Sue for organising all the bits and pieces, and for Rachel in the background, folks. Things like this don't just happen by accident, and having 50 people in multiple time zones for an hour takes a lot of work to get done. So thank you to Sue and Rachel for organising that. And thanks so much to Andrew and Michael in the background. And if you want to know more about this relationship, this connection, give us a shout, folks, particularly in respect to leadership and where we're going over the months and years ahead. Thanks very much, everyone. And that's us pretty much bang on, I think, 12. Oh, thanks very much. Look after yourselves, everyone. Thanks, folks.